There comes a moment in every soul's hidden journey when the old self begins to feel like a borrowed coat, too tight, too worn, too false to continue wearing. You do not notice it at first, but something within you has already begun to outgrow the life you once accepted. And in that quiet unrest, a calling whispers not loud, but certain. It is not asking who you are now, but who you were always meant to become. And if you are listening closely, you will realize you are never ordinary to begin with. There is a peculiar truth about transformation that the human mind resists far more than it welcomes. It rarely announces itself. It does not arrive with thunder, nor does it demand immediate acknowledgement. Instead, it enters like twilight so gradual that you are not certain when the day ended or when the night truly began. Something within you begins to shift long before you possess the language to describe it, long before you grant it permission to exist. You continue to speak, to work, to laugh in familiar ways. Yet beneath those ordinary motions, another current has already begun to flow, quiet and irreversible. At first, it feels like nothing more than subtle discomfort. The places you once fit so easily begin to feel strangely shaped against you, as though they were designed for someone you used to be, rather than someone you are becoming. Even your thoughts begin to echo differently, as if they are being spoken in a slightly altered voice that you do not yet recognize as your own. And yet, because nothing dramatic has occurred, you dismiss it. You assume it is fatigue, or mood, or the natural restlessness of an overthinking mind. But what you are really witnessing is the earliest evidence of becoming. There is a sacred irony in this stage. The transformation is most active precisely when it is least visible. Like roots breaking through unseen soil, like a seed splitting in darkness where no eye can validate its progress, your inner world begins to reorganize itself in silence. You are not yet what you will become, but you are no longer what you were. And this in-between space is often mistaken for stagnation when in truth it is preparation of the most profound kind. If one were to observe you from the outside, nothing would appear altered. You would still answer questions in the same tone, still follow routines with practiced familiarity. Yet internally, something has already begun to refuse old definitions. Certain desires that once governed your direction begin to lose their authority. Certain fears that once dictated your choices begin to lose their grip. Not because you conquered them, but because they no longer seem to belong to the same architecture of self that is quietly forming within you. This is where the mind begins its resistance. It tries to preserve continuity, to insist that you remain consistent with the identity it has catalogued for years. It whispers that change must be dramatic to be real, that transformation must be proven before it is trusted. But the deeper truth does not operate under such demands. It does not require recognition to begin its work. It proceeds regardless of permission, like dawn arriving even when the sleeper insists the night should continue. And perhaps the most disorienting part is that you cannot locate the exact moment it began. There is no single memory you can point to and say, there is where I changed. Instead, you only notice, much later, that your reactions are different, your patience shaped by unfamiliar depth, your solitude no longer empty but strangely instructive. You begin to sense that something within you is learning a new language, one that has not yet reached your conscious interpretation, one that forms itself in impressions rather than declarations, and when you try to trace it backward, you find only fragments, small, almost forgettable moments that did not seem significant at the time. A conversation you no longer respond to the same way. A desire that no longer excites you as it once did. A pursuit that now feels strangely hollow, as though it belonged to someone who was real then but is no longer fully real now. These are not dramatic departures. They are quiet separations, like threads loosening from a fabric that is still being worn, still appearing whole to the outside world, yet already in the process of being rewoven into something else entirely. This is how outgrowing your former self begins, not as rebellion, but as recognition. A subtle acknowledgement, often unspoken, that the internal landscape has shifted beyond the borders of your old identity. You do not wake up and decide to leave your past self behind, rather. You awaken and realize you can no longer fully inhabit it. The fit is gone. The alignment has changed. And what once felt like home begins to feel like a room whose walls no longer respond to your presence in the same way. There is grief in this, though it is rarely named as such, not the kind of grief that comes with loss in the conventional sense, but the quieter grief of disconnection from something that once carried your sense of certainty. You grieve the version of yourself that once felt complete, even if that completeness was built on limitation. You grieve the simplicity of being someone who did not yet know what they were becoming, because ignorance, in its own strange way, often feels like stability. Yet beneath that grief, something else is occurring, something far less sentimental and far more significant. The structure of your identity is undergoing a reorganization that does not ask for approval. It does not negotiate with comfort. It does not pause to ensure emotional readiness. It simply proceeds, as if guided by a deeper intelligence within you that already knows the direction long before your conscious mind agrees to follow it. And so what you interpret as loss is, in a truer sense, a form of alignment. Not everything that leaves your life does so. Because it has been taken away, some things depart because they no longer correspond to the shape you are becoming. The life that once held you begins to loosen its grip, not out of rejection, but out of incompatibility. It is not punishment. It is adjustment. Even your resistance, when it arises, is not a sign of failure, but of transition. The mind resists because it is loyal to what it has known, even when what it has known is no longer sufficient. It attempts to preserve the old definitions of safety, identity, and meaning, unaware that those definitions were always temporary scaffolding rather than permanent structure. And yet, despite its resistance, something deeper within you remains unmoved, quietly persistent, refusing to fully return to what it once was. In this tension between what was and what is becoming, you begin to exist in two overlapping realities. One part of you still remembers the old patterns, still reaches for familiar responses, still attempts to speak the language of your former self. But another part of you no longer fully translates those patterns into truth. It watches them with a kind of distant understanding, as though observing a story that no longer belongs to its central character, and in that quiet distance between observation and participation, resistance reveals itself in its purest form, not loud, not violent, but persistent, like an old door that insists on creaking even when it is no longer meant to be opened. It appears whenever you step closer to change, whenever you begin to act in ways that no longer align with the version of you that others still recognize. It is subtle, almost reasonable in its voice, offering explanations that sound like wisdom but are often fear in refined clothing. You begin to notice it most clearly in moments of decision. When you attempt to move beyond familiar limitations, something within you pulls backward, not with force but with familiarity. It does not say you cannot, it says you have never done this before. And in that phrase alone lies its entire strategy: to confuse the unknown with the impossible. It dresses hesitation in logic and doubt in memory. It reminds you of every previous version of yourself that failed, not to warn you, but to confine you. Yet beneath this surface-level resistance, something deeper is already forming its reply. Because resistance only exists where transformation is real. A stagnant life does not resist its shape, it merely repeats it. But when something within you begins to awaken, when identity starts to stretch beyond its old borders, resistance becomes the echo of an internal structure trying to maintain itself against inevitable expansion. It is not proof that you are wrong. It is proof that you are no longer static. There is a strange dignity in this struggle, though it rarely feels that way while it is happening. You are, in a sense, witnessing two versions of yourself negotiating for dominance: the version that is constructed from memory and the version that is being shaped by something far less visible but far more enduring. And neither of them speaks in absolute truth. One speaks from history, the other from becoming. One insists on preservation, the other on departure. What makes resistance so convincing is its intimacy. It does not feel like an external force, it feels like your own voice. It borrows your language, your doubts, your past disappointments, and arranges them into arguments that appear rational. It does not need to shout because it already knows your patterns. It understands which memories still carry emotional weight, and it uses them as anchors to slow your movement toward what you cannot yet fully see. And yet, every time you move forward despite it, something subtle shifts in its authority. It does not disappear, but it loses certainty. Its voice becomes less absolute, more repetitive, as though it is recycling arguments that are no longer landing in the same place within you. The more you act beyond its limitations, the more it reveals itself as a pattern rather than a truth. This is where awakening becomes unmistakable, not in the absence of resistance, but in your changing relationship to it. You begin to recognize that hesitation is not always insight, that fear is not always intelligence, and that familiarity is not the same as truth. You begin to separate instinct from conditioning and silence from surrender. And in that separation, a new kind of clarity begins to form, one that does not argue with resistance, but simply outgrows its jurisdiction. And as that clarity begins to take shape, something within you starts to perceive time differently, as though the past is no longer a place you are anchored to, but a field you are gradually moving beyond. The familiar weight of old fears begins to lose its density, not because they have been resolved in the conventional sense, but because they no longer occupy the same authority over your direction. What once dictated, your choices begin to feel more like distant weather, still visible, still remembered, but no longer capable of altering the path you are walking. This shift is not sudden. It does not announce itself with certainty or celebration. It arrives through accumulation, through countless small moments in which you choose differently than you once would have. And each of those moments, though seemingly insignificant on its own, begins to form a quiet architecture within you, a structure that does not depend on external validation but on internal coherence. You start to act in ways that surprise even yourself, not because you are trying to become someone new, but because the old reflexes no longer fully contain you. There is a strange tension in this stage, because you are still aware of who you used to be, yet you can no longer fully return to that state. It is not that the door is locked, it is that you no longer recognize the necessity of walking back through it. The old self does not vanish, it lingers, like an echo in a long corridor, but it gradually loses its ability to define the direction of your steps. And in that space between recognition and release, transformation becomes unmistakably active. What is happening within you is not replacement, but refinement. The raw material of your identity is being reshaped by experiences that you once interpreted differently. Even your past begins to reorganize itself under a new understanding. Events that once felt like failure begin to reveal themselves as necessary friction. Losses that once felt like endings begin to appear as redirections. And what once confused you starts to make a quieter, more coherent sense, not because the past has changed, but because you have. This is the hidden mechanism of becoming. Perception itself is being rewritten. You are not simply accumulating new experiences, you are changing the lens through which all experience is interpreted. And as that lens adjusts, your relationship with certainty begins to dissolve. You become less interested in fixed answers and more attentive to unfolding meaning. The need to be completely sure begins to weaken, replaced by a willingness to move forward without full comprehension of the entire design. Even your sense of identity begins to loosen its rigid boundaries. You stop defining yourself entirely by what you have done and start noticing what you are capable of doing. There is a subtle but profound difference between the two. Confines you to history, the other opens you to possibility. And as this awareness deepens, you begin to realize that identity is not a finished structure, but a living process, something that continues to be written through every choice, every hesitation, every act of quiet courage that does not seek recognition. And in this ongoing reconfiguration, a quiet certainty begins to form beneath the uncertainty itself. Not the certainty of knowing exactly who you are, but the certainty that you are not longer limited to who you were. And within that quiet certainty, something more profound begins to emerge, not as a declaration, but as a gradual unfolding of awareness that you were never as fixed as you once believed. The idea of a singular, unchanging self starts to feel less like truth and more like a temporary story you once needed in order to navigate a world that demanded definition. But now, that definition begins to feel insufficient, as though it cannot contain the scale of what is. forming within you, there is a subtle reversal taking place. You no longer move through life as someone trying to maintain identity, but as someone witnessing its continuous creation. Each experience no longer serves to confirm who you are, but to participate in what you are becoming. And in this shift, the urgency to be understood begins to soften. The need for external recognition loses its sharpness because something within you starts to recognize itself without requiring reflection. This recognition is not loud. It does not arrive with certainty in the way the world often expects transformation to appear. Instead, it comes as a quiet steadiness in moments where you would once have collapsed into doubt. You begin to notice that your reactions are less immediate, your emotions less controlling, your inner landscape less easily disrupted by external noise. Not because you have become detached, but because you have become less fragmented. Even solitude begins to change its nature. What once may have felt like absence now begins to feel like presence, an environment in which something within you can finally speak without interruption. And in that silence, you start to hear a continuity that was always there, but previously drowned out by the urgency of becoming someone in the eyes of others. Now, you are no longer negotiating your existence through approval, you are observing it as an unfolding reality. There is also a deepening awareness that the path you are on was never meant to mirror the paths of those around you. Comparison begins to lose its authority, not through effort, but through irrelevance. You begin to understand that alignment is not found in similarity, but in authenticity. And authenticity, though often spoken of lightly, reveals itself here as something far more demanding. It asks you to abandon the comfort of imitation, even when imitation once felt like safety. In this state, even uncertainty takes on a different texture. It is no longer something that destabilizes you, but something that accompanies you. You begin to walk with questions that do not need immediate answers. And in doing so, you discover that clarity was never meant to be a permanent condition, but a recurring moment within a much larger movement of becoming. And as this movement continues, there is an unmistakable realization forming beneath all thought and interpretation that what is emerging within you is not an improvement of the old self, nor a correction of past limitations, but an entirely different mode of existence beginning to take shape from within the same life that once felt familiar. Until even familiarity itself begins to lose its former meaning. And as familiarity begins to lose its former meaning, something within you starts to experience life as if it has been subtly relit from within, not brighter in the way excitement is bright, but clearer in the way truth becomes unavoidable once seen. The structures that once supported your sense of identity no longer feel like fixed architecture, but like temporary arrangements that were always meant to be revised. And in this realization, a deeper humility begins to form, not the kind that diminishes you, but the kind that frees you from the burden of being already complete. There is a strange reverence in this stage, though it rarely announces itself as such. You begin to observe your own life with a kind of quiet attentiveness, as though you are no longer merely living it, but also witnessing its unfolding intelligence. Events that once felt random begin to suggest patterns, not in a way that reduces mystery, but in a way that deepens it. You start to sense that nothing you have endured was wasted, even the moments you once considered misalignment or delay. They begin to appear as necessary pressure points in the shaping of something you could not yet recognize. And with this shift, the need to force meaning begins to dissolve. You stop rushing to label every experience as success or failure, gain or loss. Instead, you begin to allow things to remain unresolved for longer periods without discomfort. This is not indifference, it is maturation of perception. The mind that once demanded immediate conclusions begins to tolerate unfolding. And in that tolerance, a deeper form of intelligence begins to surface, one that does not depend on control, but on observation. Even your ambitions begin to transform. They are no longer driven by the need to prove something to the world or to yourself. Instead, they begin to feel like expressions of something already forming within you, rather than destinations you must chase. There is a difference between pursuing identity and expressing emergence. One is effortful, fragmented, constantly measuring itself against outcomes. The other moves with a quiet inevitability, as though it is not being created, but but revealed through you. And in this subtle reversal, effort itself begins to change meaning. What once felt like struggle begins to feel like alignment under pressure. You still act, you still engage, you still move toward goals, but the inner tension that once accompanied those movements begins to loosen. It is as if you are no longer pushing against life, but moving with something that was already oriented in your direction, waiting only for your awareness to match its flow. There is also a growing recognition that not everything is meant to be understood at once. Some truths you begin to realize are not revealed through immediate comprehension, but through sustained transformation. They unfold not in clarity alone, but in the gradual reshaping of the one who seeks to understand them. And so understanding itself becomes secondary to becoming. In this quiet shift, even your perception of control begins to soften. You start to notice how little of your true development was ever governed by conscious design, and how much of it was shaped in deeper layers of experience you were only partially aware of. And instead of resisting this, you begin to rest within it, sensing that what is emerging does not require your invention, only your willingness to allow it to continue. And in that willingness to allow, something within you begins to experience a subtle unraveling of certainty, not as confusion, but as liberation from the need to define every unfolding moment before it has fully revealed its meaning. The mind, once so eager to categorize life into fixed conclusions, starts to loosen its grip on immediacy. It no longer insists that every experience must be fully understood in the moment it is lived. Instead, it begins to accept that understanding often arrives later, sometimes much later, and sometimes only through the transformation of the one who is attempting to understand. This creates a quiet shift in how you relate to the unknown. What once felt like uncertainty begins to lose its threatening shape. It is no longer a void to be feared, but a space to be entered. And within that space, something unexpected happens. Your awareness expands not through accumulation of answers, but through the suspension of premature conclusions. You begin to see that much of what once disturbed you was not the presence of uncertainty itself, but the resistance to remaining within it long enough for it to reveal its purpose. There is also a deepening sense that your life is no longer merely reacting to circumstances, but responding to a larger internal movement that you are only beginning to recognize. You are not as externally directed as you once believed. Beneath the surface of decisions, preferences, and choices, there is a quieter current shaping direction in ways that cannot be easily explained through logic alone. And as you become more aware of this current, the illusion of isolated control begins to soften. This does not remove responsibility, it refines it. Because you begin to distinguish between control that is forced and participation that is aligned. One drains you through constant effort to maintain outcomes. The other carries you through a sense of coherence that does not require constant justification. And in that distinction, your relationship with effort itself begins to change again. Effort is no longer proof of struggle, it becomes expression of engagement with something already in motion. Even your internal dialogue begins to transform. The voice that once constantly evaluated, criticized, or attempted to predict outcomes becomes less dominant. It does not disappear entirely, but it loses its central authority. In its place, there is more space for perception without immediate judgment, space for experience without instant interpretation. And in that space, something quieter but more stable begins to emerge, a kind of witnessing that does not interfere but understands through presence alone. As this witnessing strengthens, you begin to notice that identity itself is no longer something you are trying to maintain. It becomes something you observe rather than defend. The urgency to be consistent in the eyes of others begins to fade, replaced by a deeper consistency that arises from within rather than from performance. And in this inward shift, you begin to recognize that authenticity was never about becoming someone new, but about ceasing the effort to remain someone you were never meant to. Permanently stay as that effort begins to dissolve. What remains is not emptiness, but a quieter form of presence that no longer depends on being constantly defined. You begin to notice that you are not held together by the certainty you once thought essential, but by something more fluid, something that persists even when all definitions are temporarily suspended. It is here that the final layer of resistance gives way, not through force, but through exhaustion of its own necessity. There is a moment, subtle and almost imperceptible, where you stop asking who you are becoming in the anxious sense of measurement, and begin instead to observe that becoming is already happening without your supervision. The self that once tried to manage every transition begins to step back, not in defeat, but in recognition that its role was never meant to be that of a controller, only a witness learning when to intervene and when to allow. In this space, even the idea of chosen begins to transform. It is no longer felt as separation from others, nor as elevation above them, but as a quiet burden of folding that cannot be fully explained through ordinary language. It is not privilege in the way the world defines it, but responsibility without announcement and inward shaping that does not seek attention because it is not built for display, but for alignment. And as this alignment deepens, you begin to sense that recognition from the world was never the true measure of what is happening within you. The external mirror grows less relevant. What matters instead is the internal coherence that begins to stabilize beneath fluctuation. You are no longer as easily pulled apart by contradiction, because contradiction itself becomes part of a larger, incomprehensible order that does not require immediate resolution. Even your sense of future begins to change texture. It is no longer a fixed destination waiting ahead, but a living extension of what is already forming within you. You are not moving toward a separate version of yourself, you are moving as that version gradually reveals itself through lived experience. And in that realization, anticipation loses its tension because the future is no longer distant, it is unfolding through you in real time. There is also a quiet surrender that emerges here, though it is not surrender to defeat, but surrender to accuracy. The need to force identity, force timing, force understanding begins to fade. You stop insisting that transformation must match expectation, and instead allow it to unfold in its own rhythm, even when that rhythm does not align with how you once imagined it should appear. And in this final unfolding, there is a recognition that cannot be fully spoken without diminishing it, that what is happening within you was never a departure from who you were meant to be, but the gradual removal of everything that could not remain once that direction began to take hold, until even the idea of recognition itself becomes secondary to the quiet certainty that you are no longer standing at the edge of becoming, but already within it.